And so in the common sense understanding of morality, we have worked our way through to its principle. Admittedly, common sense doesn't have the abstract thought of this principle as something universal. But it always has the principle in view and uses it as the standard for its judgment. It would be easy to show how common sense, with this compass in its hand, knows very well how to distinguish good from bad, consistent with duty from inconsistent with duty. To do this, it doesn't have to be taught anything new. It merely needs, Socrates' fashion, to have its attention drawn to the principle that it already has. And thus we can see that neither science nor philosophy is needed in order to know what one must do to be honest and good, and even to be wise and virtuous. That's something we might well have assumed in advance, that the knowledge of what every person is obliged to do, and thus also what everyone is obliged to know, is everyone's business, even the most common persons. Immanuel Kant. As I'm now getting into Kant's moral philosophy, I want to note that, of course, Kant is very famous for his moral philosophy. It's one of the parts of his thinking that is talked about most often. Everyone who knows anything about Kant has probably heard about the categorical imperative. Whether they actually know what it really is, whether they actually understand it or not. But I do want to stress that very often Kant's moral philosophy gets fundamentally misunderstood. And often when people talk about it, often when you have explanations of Kant's moral philosophy, especially when it's more broad explanations, like here on YouTube in a short video clip, 5 minutes on Kant's moral philosophy or whatever, it is fundamentally misunderstood. Which you can find whenever people are only talking about the categorical imperative, as if Kant's morality was all about that. The issue here is that people usually base their understanding of Kant's moral philosophy only on the critique of practical reason, or on the critique of practical reason and on the earlier work preceding it, the groundworks of the metaphysics of morals. The issue is that Kant himself says that the critique is just that. It is a groundworks. It is not the actual philosophical science itself, the metaphysics. This goes for both the theoretical critique, so the critique of pure reason, as well as the practical critique, the critique of practical reason. It is not a philosophical science itself, rather it is an inquiry into the basic elements out of which you might build such a science, and the limits such a science might have. But the actual science would be the metaphysics of nature, or when it comes to the practical, the metaphysics of morality. I discussed this more extensively in my lecture on what is philosophy and what is metaphysics. And I would claim that if you only read the critique of practical reason or the groundworks of the metaphysics of morals, you get a distorted picture. If you really want to understand what Kant's moral sentiments really were, you should at least look into his Metaphysics of Morals, which he published very late. Better yet, you should also look into his notes on morality and into the lectures on morality, on practical philosophy, which he gave throughout his life. And you will there find a very different picture. For example, you can often hear that Kant's moral philosophy is deontological. In fact, Kant is usually considered the example for deontology. So, a moral philosophy based on duty, based on what you have to do. And I mean, it's not wrong that duty plays an important part in Kant's philosophy, but usually when moral philosophy is discussed, there are various principles discussed alongside each other, deontology being one of them, consequentialism or utilitarianism, compassion ethics, and then there's virtue ethics. And if you look into the metaphysics of morals or into Kant's lectures on morality, you will find that he, not just in his earlier pre-critical works, but onto the very end, is very much a proponent of virtue ethics, which is not at all at odds with him also being a proponent of what you might call deontology. But the important part that virtue plays for Kant is often overlooked. And I would claim that not only is Kant's moral philosophy often misunderstood and distorted because people don't get the full picture, I would claim that also a lot of the criticism against Kant's moral philosophy is not really criticism against Kant's actual moral philosophy as it was, but only against this distorted picture people have of it. People often have issues with Kant's moral philosophy because they fundamentally misunderstand it. Because they take the mere letter of the categorical imperative while not understanding its spirit, turning it into, well, a dead principle, something that is just an empty formula which has nothing to do with life, and that is not what it was to Kant. So in this lecture, as well as the upcoming ones in the coming weeks and months, I want to go into more detail and hopefully give a better picture of Kant's moral philosophy. It is true that Kant's greatest achievement when it comes to practical philosophy certainly is having found and having explained with a new, never before known clarity the basic principle of all morality with his categorical imperative. So, having explained what morality actually is, what it means, and why we actually should be moral, why we have a duty to be good. When it comes to the application of his principle, of his categorical imperative, there you might rather turn to Fichte, who came after Kant. Kant here too has said good and valuable remarks, and it is worth reading that. But there are also some errors, some mistakes. And that is not just true in his practical philosophy, but that is true for Kant as a whole, I would say. And again, it is something that people often aren't fully aware of, because if you only read his published works, if you only read his critiques, it's not so obvious. You also have to read the lectures he gave, see what he actually talked to his students. And then you will find that Kant, while as a philosopher he eventually made this great critical turn, writing the great three critiques as his three main works, criticizing reason itself and the way philosophy was previously done, As a person, as an individual, Kant didn't really move along with his own revolution in philosophy, I would say. Meaning that all the critique he did didn't really change his views, neither his theoretical views on God, on the soul, nor his practical views on actual virtues and how he should behave, didn't change them very much. He retained his basic worldviews from his pre-critical time, only really, changing his view on how you could prove this worldview or on which principles this worldview was based. And this is maybe understandable on a psychological level. He could only revolutionize his thinking so much as a person. He could only move out of what he was used to, what he already believed in so much. But therefore, the general issue with Kant is that very often he doesn't fully apply or fully realize the whole radical consequences of his own new principles. Which, when it comes to moral philosophy, leads to him at times trying to rationalize something out of the categorical imperative, which is quite forced and which really doesn't work. To us moderns, it is probably most obvious in his morality on sexuality, but also it is also true for some other parts of his morality. His new categorical imperative, once he came up with it, should have actually led him to change his views. Instead, he tried to fit his views into the categorical imperative. So we need to make a distinction here when we are reading Kant now. We need to be able to make the distinction: is it the philosopher Kant speaking here in this paragraph, or is it the person, the human being Kant? But anyways, before I get into talking about the actual principles of morality, I want to make one general remark or general clarification. And that is that Kant himself didn't say that he really came up with a new morality. Nowadays we are used in our age to moral relativism. People are used to believing that there are different moralities. They will say that different people have different views on morality. They will say that different philosophers have different views on morality. That different philosophies are very much, different and in contradiction with one another when it comes to what we ought to do. And they will say, of course, that different ages have different moralities and different understandings of what is right and wrong. And this is a view that nowadays is basically taken for granted by everyone. That makes it easy to overlook the fact that it is a relatively new view. One that wasn't so prominent or taken for granted in the 18th century. And Kant doesn't share this view. For Kant, more or less all ages, all societies, all philosophers share a similar outlook on morality. To him, different philosophers disagreed on a theoretical level on why exactly something is moral and why exactly it ought to be done. But the actual practical side of morality, what should be done, here he sees great concord overall. Like, pretty much everyone would agree, for example, that you ought not to murder people or that you ought not to steal. So Kant, especially when it comes to the moral philosophy of antiquity, he doesn't see such big differences between the various schools, like the Epicureans or the Stoics or Aristotle or Plato. He believes that when it comes to the question what actually is virtue, what actually should the virtuous person do and what shouldn't he do, they are more or less in agreement. And just when it comes to the question of how exactly do we get there or why exactly should we get there, just there they had discussions. And not only does he believe that these schools of antique moral philosophy are not so much different to one another, he also doesn't find them so different to his own views. He very much valued the ancients. He had appreciation for the Stoic sentiments of the old Latin authors with which he had grown up. He had appreciation for Epicurus. And he would probably have said that overall they are in agreement with him. They didn't yet have his categorical imperative, sure. They didn't yet base their morality on that. They didn't yet explain it in that way. But what you should actually do as a moral person, that in their mind was not so different from what it was to Kant. And Kant would say that mostly when people seem to not follow the basic morality that, according to him, more or less all humans agree on, it is just against outsiders. They allow themselves to be immoral against outsiders just because they don't consider this to be immoral, because they don't consider these outsiders to really be human. So Kant discusses the fact that back in the 18th century, some people said, there are totally people who don't think that stealing is wrong. There are people who steal when you travel through their lands. There are desert nomads in Arabia that rob and plunder all the travelers that come along. And to that Kant would say, yes, maybe, but do those people steal from one another? Do they steal from their neighbor? Do they steal from their brother? Probably not. They only steal from foreigners. And that is, to him, shows that it is not that they have a different morality overall, that they believe stealing is not morally wrong. It just shows that they don't really apply their morality universally because they don't really consider the stranger human. And I mean, that is something that we can see even in modern times. I mean, consider war crimes, torture, genocide, whether it was the crimes the Nazis committed against the Jews, the Roma, the Poles, whether it is the crimes the USA committed in Guantanamo, whether it is the crimes that Israel is committing right now against the Palestinians. As terrible as all those crimes are, usually you cannot really say, oh, those people have a different sets of morals altogether. They believe that killing is okay. I mean, they would still consider killing wrong within their own group, usually. I mean, it's not that they are just complete psychopath or completely evil. Like, I'd assume that many Israelis today would be shocked if an Israeli killed a fellow Israeli or killed Israeli Jewish children. It's just when you have put others outside of humanity, so to say, when you have dehumanized others, that you don't really think that the moral rules apply to them. But that doesn't mean that in general, you wouldn't agree to those moral rules. So, to Kant, more or less, there might be some questions on which there is debate, but when it comes to the basic tenets of morality, when we put the question aside to whom, to all humans or just to my group are they applied, there is great agreement amongst people. So he didn't really consider himself the bringer or the inventor of a new morality. And that is important for me to stress because, well, I have heard this brought forth as criticism. I've heard people say, oh, who does Kant think he is, acting like he invented morality? Acting like before him everyone was immoral, everyone was evil. But that is not at all what Kant himself is saying. He stresses that his morality, when it comes to the content of it, so not the actual form, not the way it is grounded in principles, but the actual content of what you ought to do, is no different from the morality of Jesus. And Kant also stresses that you don't need him. You don't need to study him. You don't need to read the Critique of Practical Reason. And you don't need to be aware of the categorical imperative and to consciously apply it to be a practical person, to be a moral person. That is one way in which the categorical imperative is often misunderstood, as if Kant was saying we should, in each situation, think about this imperative and what it demands from us here. No, if we are a moral person, if we have goodwill, then we will just act according to this imperative usually. It's like in other sciences too. Like, I can study medicine, I can study anatomy, and I can learn about, let's say, how breathing works and how blood circulation in the body works. But I don't need to know this in order to do it. Like the average person who doesn't know anything about medicine still has blood circulation in his body. It is just about understanding what is happening here, but it can happen even without that understanding. It is very important for Kant to stress that when it comes to the practical, you don't need to be a scholar. When it comes to the theoretical side of things, to speculation, as Kant calls it, here he says that the scholar knows more, goes deeper than the common intellect. I talked about this difference between the scholarly and the common intellect in previous lectures on what is science, what is philosophy. And when it comes to theory, Kant would say the common intellect cannot just magically know the truth. Like, how would the common non-scholar, the non-scientist, ever have known that the Earth revolves around the sun and not the other way around? Or that we are made up of tiny atoms that you can't see. So here, the common intellect doesn't know better. And Kant would very much have seen it as a big issue that today there are people who just flat out deny science and say, no, there's no climate crisis or there's no COVID or whatever, while saying that whatever they claim is common sense. To this, Kant says, well, what a sharp knife can't cut, a blunt knife probably doesn't work better at cutting it. So here, the scholarly intellect is better than the common intellect when it comes to speculation. But Kant stresses that in the practical, this is not true. Here, the common intellect is just as good as the scholarly intellect. You don't need to be learned. You don't need to have a degree, to have studied at university to be a moral person. Kant in his lectures, he often likes to tell about a town in Italy in his time in 18th century, where allegedly they only took illiterate people to become judges or to become officials, administrators, and the reasoning behind that being that they assumed such illiterate, unlearned people would be more straightforward and more honest and less easily manipulated or less easily have their own agenda or whatever. And Kant often gives this example in lectures, and he seems to be sympathetic to that. He doesn't talk about it as something insane or stupid that they do in this town. And if you think about it, it must be that way. This is itself a demand of morality, so to say. You could say that the world would be immoral if it was different, if it wasn't the case that an unlearned person could be moral. Because after all, we all ought to be moral. That is the demand of the moral law. We all should be good and not evil. Well, you can only demand something of somebody which he can actually do. Kant says that an ought implies a can. You cannot be asked, it cannot said that something is your duty if you're not able to do it. So if we all ought to be good, then it follows that we all must be able to be good. But not everyone can be a scholar. It cannot be demanded that everyone needs to study at university. And the world doesn't need everyone to be a scholar. The world needs other sorts of people too. So it is very important that we can't say, oh, only the learned people can be moral and the unlearned people are condemned to be immoral. And it also is a common remark or a common trope in Kant's works to say that science, including what I'm talking about now, the science of morality, moral philosophy, science always comes last. So human beings are not starting out with full knowledge, with full understanding of things. And they don't start out doing things according to this conscious understanding. Maybe that's what God does. But humans start out just doing things, figuring things out, doing things half consciously. And only down the line do they start to reflect about what is it we are doing and to uncover the rules according to which they have acted unconsciously. So Kant would say that there was poetry long before there were theories of poetry, such as that of Aristotle. And there was orators long before there was a theory of rhetorics. And people used their intellect and reasoning and deduction long before there was a conscious theory of logic. And just like that, he would say that people have been good, people have been moral, long before there was a theory of morality. That always comes later. There is a difference, and an important one, between the common intellect and the scholarly intellect. I already discussed that in the previous lectures on what is science, what is philosophy. To Kant, the common intellect may make correct judgments in concreto, so in a specific case, but it is not correct in abstracto. So when it is asked to give a general explanation and justification. When it comes to morality, that means that the common unlearned person can probably judge correctly in most cases what is good, what is evil, but he cannot give the correct reason why it is good or evil. Let me give an example. Most people, if I ask them, would probably agree with me that rape is evil and that you ought not to rape anybody. So, given a concrete, a specific case, they know how to judge correctly. But if I now ask them why is rape evil? Why should it be forbidden? I assume that most people, if I ask them on the street, would give me an incorrect answer. I'd assume most people would say, well, it's bad because it harms the victim. It causes pain, it causes damage, not just physical, but more so emotional damage. It can traumatize the victim. So they would give a sort of utilitarian justification. Utilitarianism being the moral principle which says that you ought to cause happiness and to increase happiness in the world, and you ought to avoid pain and unhappiness. So they would say, since raping somebody makes that person unhappy, causes that person pain, it is an evil act. And that may seem like a good justification if you don't really consider it better, but let's think about, for example, there was this case recently, last year in France, that got a lot of publicity, of this woman, Gisèle Pellicot, who, it turned out, for several years had been again and again drugged by her husband, and he found random men on the internet to call them over when his wife was passed out and let them rape his wife. And this came out. The husband, along with 50 other men, were convicted. And this is something that is very clearly a terrible crime. And I would hope that everyone agrees with me that a husband drugging his wife and then letting her get raped by random men is an evil act that he should not have committed. But clearly it is not an act that necessarily causes her pain. I mean, in this specific case, okay, it came out. Now she knows about it. And of course, that might be very damaging and traumatizing, learning what has been done to you over the years. But we can easily imagine a similar case of someone raping an unconscious victim and it never coming out, the victim never finding out. Surely there are such cases. And of course, because it doesn't come out, we don't know about those cases. But it is pretty much certain that such cases exist. It was just by accident that what this husband did to his wife came out. I'm sure that amongst about 8 billion people on this earth, you are not the only one doing such a thing, and there will be other cases that don't come out, unfortunately. So we can imagine rape of an unconscious victim. If the victim never finds out, she cannot be traumatized by it. So it doesn't really cause her pain. On the other hand, it causes pleasure to the rapist. So from a strictly utilitarian calculation, it would not just be not a bad act, it would actually be a good act. And now, if you are disgusted by that reasoning, I hope you are disgusted by that reasoning. Of course, it is terribly inhumane and grossly disregarding human dignity. But that's precisely my point. I'm, of course, not arguing for rape of unconscious people here. on the contrary, I'm arguing against this utilitarian happiness principle. I'm trying to show that if you think about it, you can think of acts that don't necessarily cause unhappiness or pain, but still we very clearly see that they are immoral, and we would be disgusted by anyone trying to justify them on the mere grounds that they don't cause pain. So clearly, this cannot be the principle of morality. And to give you the correct principle, I will not go into that in more detail here. I will do that in upcoming lectures, but to already give you the correct principle, morality should not be based on pain or happiness. It should be based on the dignity of humanity, the dignity which comes from our freedom. So it should be based on regard or reverence for human autonomy. So such an act of rape is not evil because it necessarily causes pain or causes the victim necessarily to be traumatized. It is evil even if the victim never finds out and goes about her life normally, because it degrades the victim. It is an attack on the victim's dignity as a human being. It is an attack on the victim's autonomy, not respecting, not regarding the victim's freedom. That is the point. But that is what Kant is saying, that we can, as common people, judge correctly in specific cases what is moral, what is evil, but often we will not be able to give the correct reason why that is the case. And that is why moral philosophy can be important and valuable. Kant didn't claim to come up with a new sort of morality. He only claimed to have found a new formula of morality. But he also stressed that any mathematician would agree with him that having the right formula is very important and very valuable. And you could say that while according to Kant, the common intellect can make correct moral judgments in many cases, the judgments can, of course, be distorted by ideology, by society's values being pushed onto you, by a wrong moral philosophy. And here I would stress that what Kant means when he says common intellect is something that doesn't really exist anymore in our world. At least not here in the West. Because, I mean, if you think of a peasant in Kant's time in the 18th century and how uneducated that peasant probably was, you will be hard-pressed to find such a person nowadays. Nowadays, of course, not everyone is a scientist, not everyone is learned in philosophy either, not everyone is a scholar, not everyone went to university. But with our general education, what with everyone learning to read and write and at least learning some general things in school, and also what with our public society and public discourse, everyone having access to the internet, you could say that we now live in a world where everyone is at least half educated and at least a half scholar, so to say. And the true common intellect that is natural, that is more or less untouched, doesn't really exist anymore. So many people now have wrong opinions about morality. They have been fed some ideologies or whatever. And here the moral philosophy, here the critique of practical reason becomes important. It is basically the same as when it comes to theoretical philosophy, and I already discussed that in my lecture on the results of the critique of reason. Kant says that his critique as a science is not so much a positive science, what he calls doctrine, a science expanding our knowledge, teaching us something new, but rather it serves as what he calls discipline, a negative science, one that limits us, that draws the lines we must not overstep in our thinking, one that corrects our wrong opinions. And in that sense, moral philosophy is important. You could maybe compare it to medicine. You can say that even before modern medicine existed, I mean, even as far back as the Stone Age, surely not everyone was sick all the time. Surely there were people who were maybe quite healthy, without really knowing what is a healthy life or why they are healthy, but still they were healthy. And therefore they didn't really need medicine as such. But if you are unhealthy, if you get sick, then medicine to cure you becomes valuable. And likewise, if you go wrong when it comes to morality, if you are fed some wrong opinions, some wrong ideologies, moral philosophy can help you get back on the right track. And also, medicine and moral philosophy cannot just help you once you got lost or once you got sick. They can also prevent this from happening, right? It can be helpful while you can just live a healthy life unconsciously. You can just happen to always eat healthy food or whatever. It is also possible that you unconsciously lead an unhealthy life and harm your body. And here medicine can be helpful in telling you, oh, these activities you should probably not do. I don't know, you shouldn't smoke, it's not good for you. And likewise, moral philosophy can help you making sure you don't, lose your moral path, so to say. But with that out of the way, and having stressed that Kant isn't really trying to bring a completely new principle of morality, but only to better understand how morality works. And this is what philosophy, according to him, what the job of philosophy is. Not just practical, also theoretical philosophy. I addressed that in my previous lectures on what is philosophy, what is metaphysics. Empirical science might discover new things, like new stars out there, or a new species of bug that no one has known before. But philosophy, which doesn't deal with experience and with things out there in the world, but only with our own thinking and the nature and necessary structure of our own thinking, philosophy's job, according to Kant, is not so much to discover something completely new, but rather to uncover what is already there, but only unconsciously, to bring more clarity into our thinking, to make us understand ourselves better. And that is what he does when it comes to morality. He helps us understand what is morality and what do we mean by morality and what lies behind our moral sentiments. Now, the big question is precisely the question, what is the principle of morality? So what should morality be based on? Before we can get to that, it is best to start out analyzing what we mean by morality. So what characteristics should morality have? That can maybe help us find out which might be the correct and which would be an incorrect principle of morality. And I will preface this by acknowledging that nowadays, as I already said, we live in an era of relativism, so many people now will say there is no such thing as morality. They treat it as basically an old prejudice or superstition, saying there is no such thing as a moral law, as good or evil. This is a cold, uncaring universe. Maybe there are actions that benefit others or that harm others, and therefore that they like or dislike, but there's no such thing as a general moral duty. And to that I say, you can, of course, claim to believe that. But even then, even if you deny actual morality, you need to have a concept of what morality is. That goes for anything you want to deny. Like an atheist has to have an idea of God. If you don't know what something is, then you cannot judge whether it exists or not. So even the person who disagrees that there is morality should be able to talk about, well, if there was morality, what would it be? How would it look like? And here Kant would stress, and anyone would have to agree, this is just analytical, this is just what our concept of morality includes, that morality needs to be necessary and universal. Let's start with necessary. That means that morality is, after all, about good and evil. It is about our duty, about what we ought to do or ought not to do. So morality is not just about, what would be nice or kind as an action, or what would be unfriendly and kind of mean as an action, but rather it is about what action you absolutely have to do, and if you don't do it, well, you're an evil person. It's not just that if you don't act morally, like if you go around killing, stealing, raping, whatever, it's not just that, okay, I don't like it, it doesn't feel good to me, you are not nice to me, but rather you are immoral, you are acting against your duty, you are therefore evil. Morality implies that we are saying this ought to be done. This is not up to you, up to your individual liking. You cannot say, no, I don't want to do this and still be a decent person, but rather if you don't want to do this, then you are immoral, you are evil. So, and the second quality of morality is that directly comes with the first, with this necessity, is universality. Meaning that the moral law applies to everyone equally. Something either is our duty or it isn't. But you can't say it's just a duty sometimes or to some, or it's a matter of opinion. And here especially, we have this relativism today. I've often heard people say stuff like, oh, but morality is such a matter of personal opinion, it's something private, you can't force your morality onto others. And I mean, to clarify, yes, sure, you can't force your morality onto others, like you literally can't. It just doesn't work. You can maybe force people to act in a certain way, but you cannot force them to have a specific will. You cannot force specific convictions on them. And also, even if you could, you shouldn't. It would itself be immoral. So while everyone ought to act in the same moral manner, they ought to act so because they themselves understand that it is right and good to act that way, and that it would be evil to not act that way. They ought not to act like this because somebody forces them to. But still, you cannot say everyone has their own morality. As I said, I hear this relativism often. Like, in my experience, as soon as you just start talking about a universal moral principle, as soon as you just start talking about Kant, often people don't even let you finish, but immediately they will go, oh, but this is just our way of thinking about morality. The Chinese have completely different morals. It's always the Chinese for some reason. I don't know if this is a global thing or at least a Western thing, but at least here in Germany it's a thing that they will always go, oh, the Chinese have different values from us. They don't let you finish. They don't actually listen and consider what you have to say about, let's say, Kant. And neither do they consider what a Chinese person actually says. Like, most people who have said something like this to me, I think they've never even met a Chinese person, so it's not about what Chinese people actually say. And I'm not so sure that a Chinese person would say, oh, murder is okay, or stealing is okay. But it's just that this relativism is a general attitude, and people will now say, okay, it's a matter of cultural background, or it's a matter of time period. There are different opinions on morality. And I mean, to be sure, there can be different opinions on morality, but that doesn't mean that they are all equally valid. I mean, there are also people who have the opinion that the world is flat and not round, or people in the past had the opinion that the Earth is the center of the universe and the sun is revolving around the Earth. Just different people, or maybe whole time periods, having different opinions on morality is not itself proof that relativism is true and that all these opinions are equal. No, if there is morality at all, then it must apply equally to everyone. It just doesn't make sense to say, well, for me, I have these values, for me, this is good, this is evil, but that other person has different values, for him, other things are good or evil. That doesn't make sense. If that was true, then there would not be good or evil at all. Then I could say, okay, those are my personal values I choose to live by because I like them. But you cannot claim that they have anything to do with morality unless you claim that they are valid universally and that everyone who doesn't follow them is evil. That's just what morality means. It doesn't make sense, for example, to say, well, to me, it is not okay to murder that person over there. To me, that is evil. But now somebody else comes along, murders that person, and, well, to him, to that murderer, it was not evil. No. It either is evil or it is good. It cannot be both. That is simply the law of contradiction. And I mean, since this relativism is now so commonplace, I've heard here, for example, in Germany, in the debate on the ecological and climate crisis in the past years, you often read angry comments in the internet of people saying, oh, if you green people, if you climate activists, if you don't like flying or driving cars, nobody is forcing you. You can drive around with your bike, but don't force your opinions up on others. But this is completely nuts. I mean, it's not just that I personally don't want to fly because I personally don't like it. Like, I don't want to eat a certain dish because it doesn't taste good to me. But rather, if I believe that flying is evil, that flying causes harm to humanity, then of course, not just I should abstain from it, but everyone. And I mean, it's then not me forcing my opinion onto others, but it's those people who are flying. It's 3% forcing their opinion onto others with all the consequences. Because one should never tire of pointing out that if you fly once a year or more often than that, you belong to a tiny majority, to a tiny elite of 3%. Because of the global population of those 8 billion people, 97% never flew at all, or at least fly less than once a year. And maybe that sounds surprising at first, but you must not consider your surroundings. Maybe all of your friends fly regularly or whatever. You must really consider the whole global society. And if you think about it, someone from a village, let's say in Uganda or in India, probably doesn't fly that often. So it's really a tiny minority of 3% of the global population ruining the life, ruining the existence of not only the other 97%, but also of all the others coming after in the coming centuries and even millennia. Just to put that into perspective. And I mean, if you think about other cases, it becomes clear how ridiculous such a statement is. I mean, imagine you live in the time of slavery and you believe that slavery is morally wrong. You won't just be content saying, well, I don't own any slaves because to me personally, according to my values, it's wrong. But my neighbor is a slaveholder, and I mean, he has different values from me, and I can't force my morality on him. I'm free to not own slaves if I think it's wrong, but he doesn't think it's wrong, so he's free to own slaves. Or if I lived in the time of the Nazis, I couldn't just say, okay, I think that killing Jews just for being Jews is evil, so I personally don't partake in the Holocaust, I don't participate, I don't kill any Jews. But my neighbor, he's in the Waffen-SS, he's murdering Jews, and I can't force my morality onto him, he has different values from me. No, of course not. You would then not be a good person. You would maybe be a self-righteous person, someone who wants to feel good, because he can claim, oh, I am innocent, my hands are free of blood, I am not taking part in this evil. But that is not enough to be good. If you were actually a good person, you would try to fight for everyone to become good. You would try to maybe fight to end slavery or to end the Holocaust. You would try to maybe convince people to not be racist. You would maybe act like the White Rose in Germany, who protested against the Nazis. I mean, in today's time, what would you think of someone, seriously, who told you, oh, I know that my neighbor is abusing his wife and his children and raping his kid or whatever. Personally, I don't do such things. I think it's wrong. But I can't tell my neighbor what to do. No. If you really think it's wrong, you think it's not just wrong for you to do that, but it's wrong for everyone to do that. So you would try to stop your neighbor. You would maybe call the police on your neighbor. And as a side note here, this is a clear sign of ideology. I would say that, of course, people can make errors in thinking. Of course, people can have wrong opinions. But some opinions, some statements, they are not just wrong, they are outright stupid. Stupid to a degree that is not believable. Like, of course, some people may be smarter than others, some people may be a bit more stupid, but there is a level of stupid that I just refuse to believe in. And when you are confronted with such a statement, which is so stupid that it is mind-boggling, and that anyone who doesn't share a certain ideology immediately sees that stupidity, then that is a clear sign that you are dealing with ideology, right? So, for example, here in Germany, we have lots of people. Just yesterday I had such a conversation again of someone telling me that the slogan from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is by itself, always, without exception, anti-Semitic. That is clearly stupid. Like, you could talk to a child about this, and any child would understand that this is not the case. When you are confronted with such stupidity, you know, since people cannot be that stupid, it must have another reason than stupidity. And the reason is clearly ideology. This seemingly stupidity, this is a mark of ideology that I would advise you to always look out for. And when you are dealing with ideology, mere rational arguments don't work. Because if that person was open to reason, then he would realize the stupidity of what he's saying. Like this moral relativism, I've dealt with it before, I've discussed it before, and in my experience, I've tried when people said, "Oh, everyone has different opinions about morality. The Chinese have other values than us," and you didn't mean to say, "Okay, one of us has wrong values," but rather both values are equally valid, which is just a ridiculous statement. I have often replied with extreme cases. I've said, "Oh, okay, so would you say the Holocaust is not definitely evil then? Would you say, I mean, the Nazis just had different values? Just like the Chinese today, they have different values, so they can suppress the Uyghurs or the Tibetans or the people of Hong Kong. So just like that, the Nazis could gas the Jews. They just had different values." In my experience, the relativist will then often make a pained face and say something along the lines of, "Well, okay, this is an extreme case, but this has nothing to do with regular everyday morality, where not everything is black and white. You must not use such extreme cases." I would posit that even more everyday examples would often be quite clear to that relativist. Like, you don't have to go as extreme as the Holocaust. You can use regular murder. You can ask him, "Is it okay to be a murderer?" He would probably still not think it's okay. Or even, what I like to say, of course, don't actually take it literally, don't actually do it, but I like to say, if someone is a moral relativist, if someone tells you not everything is black and white, just punch his teeth in. Look how he reacts. Or even just key his car. Look how he reacts. If he's angry at you, if he says you shouldn't have done that, that was wrong of you, tell him, "Well, it's wrong according to your values, but I have different values according to my values. It was perfectly fine. And not everything is black and white." See how he will like it. This is exactly why I have so little respect for relativists. Not because they are wrong. You can have a wrong opinion that you sincerely believe in. But what I despise is intellectual dishonesty. You must be intellectually honest and rigorous, and those relativists are not. If you think about it and if you question them a little, it's not so much that they are relativist completely when it comes to morality. Because you just cannot be that. It just doesn't work to say there are different moralities, different values that are equally valid. If you want to say that, the only real option you have is to say there's no morality at all. Like, that would be a position that has some internal consistency at least. But you cannot say there are different moralities and they are equally valid. That is just the same as saying none of them is valid. So in my experience, those people are not necessarily relativistic in general. They only become relativists, curiously enough, when you talk about their own moral duties. Like, they will say, yes, the Holocaust was evil, because, I mean, the Holocaust is in the past. It doesn't directly concern them. And they have grown up, they've been taught, especially here in Germany, that you must, of course, condemn the Holocaust and be against the Holocaust to be a good German. And likewise, they will say when you attack them, when you punch them, that this is evil, because now it's about their rights, not about their duties. But when you talk about their duties, when you say, you shouldn't fly, or you shouldn't buy things made in China, you should boycott China, then, and only then, they suddenly become relativistic and talk about having different values and so on and so on. And again, this is the intellectual dishonesty here. But going back to the question, what should be the principles of morality? We now see morality, if there is such a thing at all, must be necessary. It must be about our duty, not just something that would be nice to do, but we are also free to not do. No, it is something we ought to do, and otherwise we are evil and should be condemned and are guilty. And also, it is universal. It is about a duty that everyone has. Well, the question now is there such a thing, and on what could we base it? And here, when you nowadays try to learn about principles of morality, about theories of morality, most material you will find, unfortunately, is completely worthless. This goes for most introductions for lay people, like introduction books or videos here on YouTube. But even at the academy, many of those lectures and introduction to moral philosophy or whatever, they are completely worthless. And I know how that sounds. I get such comments here, or at least on the German channel. I've gotten comments, oh, this is so arrogant. Who do you think you are to say all of this is worthless? Well, I'm sorry if I'm triggering somebody, but as a philosopher, I need to be an advocate of truth and of, again, intellectual rigor and thoroughness. And the issue nowadays is you will often hear in this introductory material that there are various moral principles. Like some classics, you will hear there's deontology and there's virtue ethics. And here the issues already start because, as I told you, Kant is usually taken to be the example of deontology, but he is also an example of virtue ethics at the same time. They are not excluding each other or contradicting each other. And then there's ethics of compassion, or there's consequentialist ethics, with utilitarianism being the most prominent case of that. I advise you, whenever you hear these listed, walk away. If it's a book, put the book away. If it's a lecture, stop listening to it. Don't waste your time. Because this is not... Well, this is kind of like if you had a lecture on biology and the so-called biologist told you, well, amongst animals, there are animals that lay eggs, there are animals that eat meat, there are animals that live in the water, and there are kangaroos. This is not a good division, obviously. I mean, sure, you could divide all animals into, for example, those that lay eggs and those that don't. Or those that eat meat and those that don't eat meat. But clearly there's an overlap here. Clearly here you have different divisions mixed up with one another. Like, clearly there are animals that lay eggs and eat meat. It's not something that excludes each other. And that is true for these so-called moral principles that you often hear about nowadays. A basic issue here is that people make no proper distinction between let's say, the justification of morality and the measurement of morality. So, why should you do the moral action? And what is the moral action? Because those are two different questions, right? So, for example, consequentialism would be the moral principles saying what is or isn't a moral action is determined by the consequences of that action. You should do an action that has good consequences. As I already said, the most prominent example would be utilitarianism, which defines good consequences basically as that which brings happiness, and bad consequences as that which brings pain. Okay, maybe that is a good definition of what is a moral action. It actually isn't, but that aside. But that doesn't tell you why you should do that. maybe it is moral to cause happiness and immoral to cause pain, but why? Why should you do that and why should you not do that? And then if you have ethics of compassion, well, they tell you that you should act on your compassion. You should have compassion or empathy for other human beings or even for animals. But it should be clear that this ethics of compassion can actually be mixed with utilitarianism. I could say you should cause happiness and you should try to prevent pain because of the empathy you have with other sentient beings. But then on the other hand, you have the principle of deontology, which would be a morality based on duty, wherever that duty may come from. And I could also claim that there is something like a deontological utilitarianism. I could say you must cause the greatest happiness or prevent the greatest pain. This is your moral duty. So there's a mix between what is a morality's justification, why we should be moral, and what is the measurement of morality, how I decide what is and what isn't a moral action. And in any case, these common divisions of various moral principles that you find, the basic issue here is that it is completely unscientific. How did we arrive at these divisions? Well, by basically just looking around. We arrived at them empirically, historically, looking around in the history of philosophy, looking amongst the opinions that people have uttered, and trying to find all the opinions and just put them along each other. So it's an eclectic work. It's a rhapsody of moral principles. And this way, you can never be sure if you have got all of them, or maybe there's one you missed, or one that nobody thought of so far, but maybe in the future someone will come up with. You also cannot be sure if those that you did find really should be put along each other as equal principles, or maybe one of them is just a special case of one of the others. This creates what Kant would call an aggregate. It's like a pile of sand with just various grains of sand thrown around. I talked about this in my lecture on what is science. To Kant, science must be organic. It must be a system and not an aggregate. And that means science must be architectonic. I also already gave a lecture on Kant's architectonic method in science. To him, you need to not do it empirically, but rather when it comes to the actual system, to the, so to say, skeleton of a science, you need to produce that from your own reason. You need to start from a general principle of reason, and you need to deduce from that principle all the possible cases that would be, well, possible. To know how this science could even be structured, to know a priori, without looking historically at experience, what opinions on morality one could even have. Well, and this is precisely what Kant does, and he says that there are only two general principles of morality. Empiricism and rationalism. Because, and once again, I discussed this further in my lecture, What is Science, to Kant, all our knowledge only has these two sources. As human beings, we are both sensual and intellectual beings, and we can find knowledge through experience. We can have a posteriori knowledge, empirical knowledge, or we can find knowledge through our own reasoning. We can have rational cognition. through mere thinking. And that would be a priori knowledge, so knowledge that precedes our experience, knowledge for which experience is not needed. Well, if those are the only two forms of knowledge, then it stands to reason that this is also true for morality. Our knowledge, what is or isn't moral, if we can have such a knowledge at all, must come from one of those two sources. Well, and then Kant makes a subdivision for both of them, because he says there's always an inner and an outer version. Let's start with the empiricism of morality. Practical empiricism would claim that we know what is moral and what we ought to do, not through our thinking, not a priori, but we can only find it out from experience. And well, here the difference is that the outer empiricism claims we find what is moral from some sort of outer experience, from experiencing the world around us, while the inner empiricism claims we find out what is moral through some sort of inner experience. Now, the outer empiricism would base what is moral basically on other people. Kant says you can base it on the general customs and values of your society. So you can say whatever I find from experience that people hold to be moral or hold to be something you should or shouldn't do, that is what morality is based on. A proponent of this, according to Kant, would be Michel de Montaigne. You could also, as an outer empiricist of morality, say that it is based on law. So whatever the state that you live in forbids, that is forbidden, and whatever that state allows or even commands you, that is allowed or commanded. Here Kant would cite Thomas Hobbes as an example. Well, it is very clear that this outer empiricism of morality doesn't work. It leads directly to the relativism I already addressed. If you say, well, there is no general a priori knowable morality, then you can only find it out what you should do by looking at the positive law, so the law that is actually in place, that is actually given by your state. Then it was not immoral in the days of the Nazis to kill the Jews. Then anything could be moral or immoral, because any law can be changed, and it is completely arbitrary. It is a matter of, going back to my previous lecture on the will and choice, it is a matter of choice. The lawgiver, like for example, going with Hobbes, the sovereign, the monarch, can just choose what is or isn't moral. And likewise, if with Montaigne we base our morality on the customs, on the values of a given society, then I can say, well, those can change. Other societies have other values. In other societies it was fine to, if you didn't like your child, if your child was disabled or whatever, to just let it die or whatever. So clearly this outer empiricism leads to relativism and thereby to basically saying there is no universal moral law. On the other hand, you have inner empiricism, which, as I already said, is also as empiricism based on an experience, but based not of experiencing the world, the society, the government around you, but experiencing your own inside, your own feeling. This would be a morality based on feelings, on your own inner moral feeling. And Here Kant is mostly thinking of what is nowadays called moral sense theory, which was very prominent in British thinking at the time in the 18th century, and which was proposed by authors which Kant read and was to some degrees influenced by, valued to some degrees. Authors such as Shaftesbury, Hutcheson, Hume, um, who claimed that a human being has a moral sense, a sort of sixth sense, just feeling what is right or what is wrong. All the moral principles based on compassion, based on feeling for the other, feeling the other's pain and having compassion, having pity with that pain, would fall under this inner empiricism of morality. And I would say that nowadays, when people are not outer empiricists and therefore complete relativists, this is probably the most popular principle of morality. So lots of people who do want to be moral or to advocate for morality in the world, even if they don't necessarily use that word morality, because the word itself has become sort of old-fashioned. But still, if they want to advocate for acting good in the world, caring for others, people who are somewhat humanitarian or many leftist people or whatever, they will talk about having compassion, having empathy, feeling the pain of others. And it sounds nice and all, but other issues aside, the problem is that this too doesn't work as a general moral principle. First of all, it's not universal. Not everyone has this compassion. Like, I could say, oh, when I see people suffering, I have empathy, so I don't want to see them suffering anymore. I want to stop their suffering. But if another person doesn't have empathy, if another person is just cold-hearted or maybe even cruel and sadistic, what can I really say? I cannot blame that other person. I cannot say that other person is guilty. I cannot say you should feel empathy. Because from what point am I arguing here? Clearly not from the point of empathy. If I say you should, it is your moral duty to feel compassion for others, then I have already, whether I want to or not, based my morality on a higher principle than compassion, on some sort of general duty. And also, empathy or compassion, moral sense of any sort, they don't constitute moral necessity. They don't constitute duty. Because I can say, okay, when I see somebody suffering, maybe my own heart bleeds. Maybe I feel compassion. Maybe it pains me to see him that way. But that doesn't give me the duty to stop his and thereby also my pain. I could suppress this feeling of mine and still act cruel against that other person. And I mean, there are cases where maybe it is good to not act according to my feeling, to maybe do something which pains me. Like, if I have an issue with my teeth, if I have a hole in my teeth, I need to go to the dentist, and the dentist will drill into my teeth. That doesn't necessarily feel nice, but here it is the wise thing to suppress this bad feeling I have. So who's to say that maybe it isn't sometimes right to suppress the bad feeling of compassion, of empathy I have when others suffer? So, in general, the empiricism of morality doesn't work. As I said before, morality needs to be both necessary and universal, and nothing empirical can ever be. I already discussed that in the lecture on what is science. The empirical cognition, the a posteriori cognition, can not ever be necessary. That is not just true for the practical, but also for the theoretical, right? So empirically, I can of course find that many swans are white, sure, but I cannot find that they must be white, that it is impossible for one to be black. And for that very reason, Kant says the a posteriori cognition can at best have generality, but never universality. So I can say this is the case often, or maybe this is the case always as far as I know. But I can never say this is definitely always and will forever be the case, because I could only say this if it was necessary. So if morality is to be necessary and universal, it must be based on a judgment a priori, because as I discussed in that lecture on what is science, those are exactly the two characteristics of any judgment a priori, of any judgment from pure reason. And that leads us to moral rationalism, which would be the position that morality is not based on an experience, not on outer experience of the customs and values of the people or the laws of the land, and not inner experience of your own moral sense, of your own compassion or whatever, but rather it is based on reason. But here too, Kant distinguishes an outer and an inner rationalism. And outer rationalism would claim that we can find the source of morality through our reason, but it is not inside of us, it is outside of us. So with our reason, we sort of go outside of us. And this would be all the theories that try to base morality on God and on God's commandment. Here, we don't find morality just from experience, because we don't have experience of God clearly. Rather, we do have to think about it, Kant would say. But our thinking leads us to believe that this or that is God's commandment for some reason. Well, this is a position that back in Kant's time still many claimed to be the correct position, that you can base morality only on religion, really, and without religion you don't have morality. It was a great scandal, in fact, in the 18th century when Christian Wolff, the so to say head and founder of the Leibniz-Wolfin school, claiming that the Chinese not only didn't have Christianity, but that they had no natural religion, no idea of God at all, and still had correct moral sentiments or correct moral philosophy. Nowadays, this position, this outer rationalism basing morality on religion, has fallen out of favor. You will not really hear anyone doing that seriously anymore. Of course, I mean, in serious circles, in academic circles, like in what is called the philosophical debate nowadays, this is not really a position that is taken seriously anymore. Of course, outside of that, you looking at the world as a whole, you still have many people who would claim, no, morality must be based and can only be based on religion. Especially fundamentalists, no matter of which phase, will claim that and will tell you, well, without God telling you what is good or evil, how do you know? How would you know that murder is evil without God telling you? But this is a position that has many flaws, and I will come back to that a little in upcoming lectures. But one fundamental flaw here is that how do you know what is God's will and commandment? Like, do you go with what the Bible says? Do you go with what the Quran says? There are different sources, right? Not even mentioning how you can take one and the same source and interpret it in various manners. And even before that, how do you even know that there is a God? I mean, even if we had that proven, we still would have to ask, how do we know what God wants from us? But we don't just not know what God wants from us, we don't even know if there is a God. So this is not really a good way to found morality. Indeed, Kant would go the exact opposite way. I will just mention that as a side note here. I will talk about it more in future lectures when I get to Kant's philosophy of religion. But he says that you mustn't ever try to ground morality in religion. That will lead to basically paganism and superstition and complete immorality. But rather you must go the other way around. You must ground religion in morality. So Kant wouldn't say, okay, you can take the Bible or the Quran or whatever and they tell you what you should do. Because how do you know they are even from God? Rather, he would say, you can ask yourself what you should do, what is moral and what isn't, and then you can look at the Bible and the Quran or whatever, and if they tell you something that goes against morality, then that is proof that they don't come from God. Because God would not command you to do evil. If God commands you, for example, to kill somebody, like for example commanding Abraham to kill his own son, then you know this cannot be God. Maybe it's some demon, maybe it's some hallucination, maybe it's a made up story, but it certainly isn't God who wants this. While on the other hand, if the text is moral and commands you to do moral things, that is not a proof, a positive proof that it is from God, but at least that allows you to believe that it might come from God. But anyways, I will talk about that more in the future when I get to the philosophy on religion and specifically on revealed religion. Now we are left with the fourth option, and that is inner rationalism. Again, as rationalism, it would claim that we can know what is moral a priori. We don't need outer or inner experience. We only need our thinking. But here we don't need to think about something outside of us, about God or whatever, but rather we find, so to say, the moral principle in ourselves. And this would be the principle of perfection. This is the position that the Leibniz-Wolffian school of philosophy had. I already talked about them in previous lectures, especially the one on criticism, dogmatism, and skepticism. Basically, Leibniz, the certainly most important modern German philosopher before Kant, Leibniz's thoughts had been taken up by Wolff, Christian Wolff, who systematized them and who advanced them, built upon them, and thereby became the most influential thinker in Germany for a time, becoming basically the founder of what has been called the Leibniz-Wolffian school of philosophy, which was the most prominent at German universities in the 18th century, which was what Kant himself had been influenced by. And so thinkers of that school, like Wolff himself or like Wolff's successor on the professorship in Halle, Baumgarten, they would claim that morality is about striving for perfection. Doing that which is perfect, doing perfect actions, perfecting yourself. And curiously enough, this is, out of the 4 moral principles I mentioned, the one that is least known today. All the other 3 still have proponents and adherents. There are still people being relativists claiming there is no real morality, there's just customs or laws of different countries or societies or times. There's still people claiming, well, you should act on your inner feeling, on your compassion. And there's still people claiming morality can only be based on God's command. But you don't hear many people, certainly not outside the academy, but not even inside the academy, talking about morality being about perfection and doing perfect actions. And not just is this a position that doesn't really have any disciples anymore, it isn't even known anymore, not even historically as something that once had disciples, as a position that you possibly could take and people took at some point, even if nowadays no one does so anymore. Like in those usual introductions to moral philosophy that talk about virtue ethics and utilitarianism and deontology, you will usually not find this mentioned. And to me, it wasn't talked when I studied. It wasn't ever mentioned in any lectures, not even in passing. Which again goes to show the sorry state that the history of philosophy and a lot of the scholarship on philosophy, and especially the more popular aimed at lay people talks about philosophy are. I mean, they just leave out parts of the history of philosophy. And no matter what you think of those parts, no matter if you agree with them or not, if you want to give a comprehensive overview, you should at least mention that this is a possible position, that this is a position some people held. But it just seems that this position is, well, it has become very untimely. It has completely fallen out of fashion, and it is very strange and distant to our age. So much so that people not only don't know that it once existed and that you in theory could hold this position, but even to the point that they probably don't even understand it. They probably don't even understand what it is supposed to mean that you ought to do the perfect action. Kant agrees, however, with that in a way. He does say that this Leibniz-Wolffian position is completely empty and unphilosophical. For one, perfection itself is an empty measurement, because Kant says there is no such thing as perfection in itself. Something can only be perfect for something. So I can say, when I have a knife, this is a very sharp knife, so it is perfect for cutting. But I cannot say that sharpness as such is a mark of perfection. If I don't want to cut anything, then I don't need anything sharp. So perfection needs a concept of purposiveness. You need a purpose that you want to achieve, and then you can say, what I have here is purposive. It is perfect for achieving that purpose. Which also means you cannot base morality on perfection as such, because you need a last purpose. Without that, you cannot talk about perfection or imperfection. And even that aside, even if we knew what perfection ought to mean, there would still be the question, why should we strive for perfection? Why is it moral to do the perfect action, whatever that may be, and not the imperfect action? Why should that be my duty? So the inner rationalism doesn't really work either. So all four moral principles that I talked about, empiricism and rationalism of the outer and the inner kind, they all have issues, they all don't work. Does that mean that there is no morality after all? You cannot really justify a moral law, a moral duty, and therefore morality is after all just a prejudice, just an old superstition. No, that's not what Kant says, of course. If you consider those four principles in total, you can find that they all share one and the same issue. The issue being that they try to base morality on being, on something that is. Now, they differ in what being they base morality on. So, whether it is the way society is or the laws are, or whether it is the way your feeling is, your inner feeling, or whether it is the being of God and of God's commandments, or whether it is whatever is perfect. But they all start out saying something is the case, there's a fact, and then from that it follows that you should do a certain action. And that doesn't work. It's not just Kant who discovered that this doesn't work. It was discovered before him by Hume, who just like in the theoretical philosophy here too was important and influential for Kant. This is what nowadays often gets called the naturalistic fallacy. So when you claim that there's a certain being, something is the case, and try from that to derive at a certain moral duty or moral judgment. Like, for example, when people tell you homosexuality is wrong because it is unnatural. Leaving the question aside whether it really is unnatural, I mean, it certainly does happen in nature. It happens amongst animals. And I, for one, don't know what other criterion we would have of calling something natural or unnatural besides saying it occurs in nature or it doesn't. But let's say homosexuality is unnatural. Okay, fair enough. But from that, it doesn't follow that you ought not to do homosexual acts or ought not to be homosexual. That would only follow if we posit that anything unnatural is bad and you mustn't do something unnatural. But that itself would then be a higher principle which cannot derive from the fact that a certain thing, like let's say homosexuality, is unnatural. Likewise, you have the same issue when it comes to morality of compassion or basing morality on feelings of happiness and pain. Like, if I ask, why should I not hit someone? Why should I not beat someone? Many people would tell me because it is painful for that person. So, that again is a being, and is, right? It is painful. That is a fact. That is how the world works. And I can acknowledge this being. Like, I would contest whether homosexuality is natural. I would not contest that beating someone up is usually painful for that person. But from the fact that beating someone causes them pain, it doesn't follow that therefore you should not beat someone. I often find that many people, lay people, especially people who are very empathic and very much base their morality on compassion, have a problem understanding this because they just cannot abstract from their feeling. They cannot abstract that they feel compassion at someone else hurting and therefore they don't want to cause that pain. But that is fair enough, okay, so you don't want it. But we are not talking about what you want, but what you ought to do. We are talking here about duty, not about wishes. The point is, I can agree with the fact that, yes, hitting someone causes him pain. That is a fact, that is a being. But from that it doesn't follow that I ought not to hit him. There is another premise needed here, and that would be the statement, you ought not to cause pain to people. Only if we use that as a general duty, don't do anything that causes pain, and now we consider the fact that hitting someone causes pain, only then can we say you ought not to hit someone. But how do you get this duty, you ought not to cause pain? It clearly cannot follow from something being the case in the world. And this is the basic issue behind all four of those moral principles. They all try to start from something that is. Well, many people nowadays, based on this insight of Hume's that an is can never lead to an ought, many would say, so there's no ought at all. Because many people nowadays are materialists. They only believe in being. They only believe in what they can see and touch and grab. But not so Kant. He would say, as I already discussed in the lecture What is Philosophy, that philosophy has two parts. Theoretical philosophy, the philosophy of nature, which here is to be understood in the most general sense, so including the sensual nature, but also the supersensual nature, God or the soul. Theoretical philosophy is about being, about asking what is, for example, is there a God, and how is it, according to which laws does it function, what are the laws of nature, for example. While practical philosophy, the philosophy of freedom, is about not an is, but a shall. How shall we act? What do we ought to do with our freedom, and what do we ought not to do? And the great achievement of Kant is to clearly separate the two. To say there is no direct connection between them. You cannot base practical philosophy on theoretical philosophy. No, you cannot say something ought to be done because something is the case. That doesn't mean that there is no ought at all. It just means that the ought, so to say, must be grounded in itself and not in an is. And how does that work? I don't want to get into that in this lecture. I will discuss it further in the coming lectures, but just in general, Kant is ultimately still a rationalist when it comes to morality, but he proposes a new kind of rationalism. The rationalism I mentioned, both the outer and the inner rationalism, is dogmatic, is objective, while Kant's rationalism is critical and subjective. And that means that Kant's solution here to this problem is consistent with his philosophy as a whole. It's the same solution he always has. The same solution he has in theoretical philosophy when it comes to where do we get the basic intellectual concepts like causality from. I discussed that in the lecture on Kant's conciliation between empiricism and rationalism. And it's the same solution he has in aesthetics when it comes to the question what is the pleasure in the beautiful and in the sublime? Is it sensual pleasure, as the empiricists claim? Is it intellectual pleasure, as the rationalists claim? I discussed that in my lecture on pain and pleasure. You often hear that Kant reconciled empiricism and rationalism and found a middle ground between them. That is correct. That is what he does according to his sympathetic method. This also already got a lecture that you might check out. The sympathetic method is based on the insight that there is no total error, only partial error, when there are two opposing opinions like empiricism and rationalism. Both have a point, just not the whole point. So you should find a sort of third middle position that combines them both. I still have my issues whenever it is said that Kant found a middle position or combined rationalism and empiricism, because that can easily give you a wrong picture, as if he was equally distant to both of them or combined them in equal ways. And it should be stressed that no, Kant is definitely on the side of rationalism always and not on empiricism. He does believe that there is such a thing as reason, and that reason is not just ordering and structuring our experience, but really can bring forth new cognitions that don't come out of experience at all. So here, when it comes to morality, I think I already made clear why he must be a rationalist. Because morality, if it is to exist at all, must be necessary and must be universal. And those are exactly the characteristics of a judgment a priori. So of not empirical, but rational cognition. So if morality exists at all, it must be based on a rational principle. It must be something that we can find not just from experience, because that would always lead to moral relativism. I could always then say, well, I experienced this, these customs, or this feeling of compassion, but another person experiences something else. Other customs, other laws, or other feelings, a feeling of sadism maybe, and not compassion. Morality must be based on reason. But, as I said, the rationalism that came before Kant and the rationalism of the Leibniz-Wolfin school was dogmatic rationalism, was objective rationalism. So a rationalism that claims that with reason we can get to the things in themselves. So with reason I can, in theoretical philosophy, somehow find that there really is such a thing as causality. Or with reason, in aesthetics, I can somehow find that something is perfect and therefore beautiful. And likewise, here in practical philosophy, with reason I can somehow find what is the moral law. As if there was this moral law as a, so to say, separate entity floating in the ether, independent of me. And I, with my reason, would just find it. Thinking about it, I would find out either what does God want from me, or what is objectively perfect, or whatever. While Kant says, no, we must go with subjective rationalism, with critical rationalism, meaning our reason can only really deal with itself. Our reason cannot find causality as a thing that exists in itself, but it can find that we must think in terms of causality, and we can therefore, because we must think like this, never experience anything without causality. So whether the things in themselves are caused or not is another question, but the things that appear to us must appear as being caused. Likewise, in aesthetics, we cannot say that something is objectively perfect and therefore beautiful objectively, but we can say that it is purposive with its form for us, that our faculty of cognition can play with it, can find it to have a fitting form for itself, and therefore we must find it beautiful. And the same is true when it comes to practical philosophy, to morality. Kant bases it on critical rationalism, on subjective rationalism, saying that we don't find the moral laws through our reason as something that already exists independently of our reason, but rather we make it. Our reason posits the moral law and gives the moral law to itself. But it is not arbitrary. It's not something that we just choose to make and could also make in a different way, but rather all reason of all rational beings, because reason is always one and the same, by its nature, so to speak, must come to give itself one and the same moral law. And that is exactly where our actual duty comes from. If it was something, if the law had some source outside of us, we could always ask, well, okay, but why should I have the duty to follow it? Why should I do what is perfect? Even if I can say, yes, objectively this action is perfect, what does it matter to me? Or why should I do, even if it is God's command, why should I do God's command? Okay, maybe you can say if I don't do it, I will end up in hell, being tortured for the rest of eternity. But that's not really a moral reason to do it. That's a selfish reason. I would then just do good actions out of self-preservation. Only this subjective critical rationalism actually leads to a duty, because here I can say, why should I do what is moral? Because I myself say that I should do it. There is no further reason outside of it. If you need a reason outside of duty, then it is not about duty. Then it is about something, some other interest of yours. Then it is about, let's say you go with compassion. Well, you act nice to others because you would feel bad if they felt bad. So really it is a selfish action in the end. If it is about God, as I already said, maybe you do what God wants or what you think God wants because you don't want to end up in hell. So again, it's a selfish action. If you need a reason outside of duty, then you are not acting out of duty. But here, if we say reason itself gives itself a law, then it doesn't need a further reason. It just says this is how I should act, because I myself understand that this is how I should act. Period. Maybe you won't fully understand that here. That's fine, no worries. I will go further into that in the coming lectures and further explain what is the moral law, what is the categorical imperative, how does Kant find it, and so on. But here I just wanted to first make this general clarifying remarks. First off, that Kant doesn't claim to have found a new morality, but just found the actual basis of the morality that was already there. And second, I wanted to show those are the only possible ways you could justify a morality, either empirically or rationally. It clearly, if it is to be true morality, must be justified rationally, but then you must not go with dogmatic-objective rationalism, trying to use your reason to find some moral law that exists outside of you, but rather, as Kant shows, as is his great accomplishment in moral philosophy, the great revolution, your reason itself is the lawgiver, demanding from itself to act in a rational, and that is in a moral manner. And everything else I will explain in the further upcoming lectures. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Ökobong, Samet Özkilic, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.